May 2nd, 1947, 9:01 in the morning, Hamelin Prison, Germany. The British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, the same man who had hanged dozens of Nazi war criminals in the months since the war ended, was standing at the gallows when Dorothea Binz walked in. She was 27 years old. She was calm. She walked to the gallows without hesitation, without being dragged, without breaking down. And then, just before Pierrepoint put the hood over her head, just before he tightened the noose, just before the trapdoor opened beneath her, she spoke her last words. She took off her necklace, handed it to her executioner, looked at him, and said, "I hope you will not think we were all evil people." Then the trap opened. She was gone. 9 minutes later, at 9:10, she was pronounced dead. Her body was placed in a coffin and buried in an unmarked grave, the British making sure her name would not be honoured anywhere on earth. This is the story of Dorothea Binz, the woman they called the beautiful devil of Ravensbrück, the youngest of the 5 women executed that morning, and the one whose last words have never been forgotten. Dorothea Binz was born on March 16th, 1920, in Försterei, Dusterlake, a small settlement in the province of Brandenburg, in what was then the Weimar Republic. She came from a lower middle-class family. Her father worked as a forester. She attended school until she was 15 years old. And then, like many young women of her class and generation who had no path into higher education, she entered domestic service, working as a maid. There was nothing in her early life, by any account, that marked her out as exceptional in any way. She was an ordinary girl from a small settlement in provincial Germany, doing ordinary work, in a country that was rapidly transforming around her. The transformation was the Nazi movement. By the time Binz was a teenager, the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, the BDM, were shaping the worldview of an entire generation. The ideology they taught was not subtle. Racial hierarchy, absolute obedience. The idea that Germany's enemies were internal as well as external, and that the strongest virtue a German young person could possess was loyalty to the state above everything else. Whether Binz was deeply ideologically committed or simply shaped by the world she grew up in is something historians have debated. What is not debated is what she chose to do next. In August 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began, Dorothea Binz, 19 years old, volunteered for kitchen work at Ravensbrück concentration camp. The following month, in September 1939, she was given a position as Aufseherin, a female overseer, a guard. She had not been conscripted, she had not been assigned, she had volunteered. And from the moment she put on the uniform, she took to the role with something that went far beyond compliance. Ravensbrück was the only major Nazi concentration camp built specifically for women. It was located near Fürstenberg, in northern Germany, about 90 kilometers north of Berlin, on the shores of a lake. It opened in May 1939 and, by the time it was liberated by the Soviet Army, on April 30th, 1945, had processed approximately 130,000 prisoners, women from across occupied Europe, Jewish women, Polish political prisoners, Roma women, Soviet women, women from France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Yugoslavia. The estimated number who died there was 92,000. It was also the primary training facility for female SS guards. Some 500 women underwent their guard training at Ravensbrück before being sent to other camps across the system. Among those other camps, Stutthof, whose female guards this channel has already covered in previous videos. Binz rose through the ranks at Ravensbrück with striking speed. By 1940, she was a full Aufseherin. By 1943, when she was just 23 years old, she had been promoted to Oberaufseherin, the chief wardress, overseeing approximately 1,000 female guards across the camp. She was the youngest person to hold that position at any major concentration camp in the Nazi system, M14 EBR, and the testimony of survivors about how she used that position is some of the most disturbing material in the entire documentary record of the war. Witnesses at her trial described her patrolling the camp on a bicycle, a German shepherd dog at her side, a whip in her hand, beating prisoners randomly as she passed. Not in response to any infraction, not as punishment for any specific act, but simply because she could. They described her forcing groups of prisoners to stand for hours in freezing weather, sport. It was called in the camp's internal language, until people collapsed. They described her beating women to death in the bunker, the camp's internal jail, where prisoners were held in darkness in tiny cells barely large enough to stand in. They described her participating in selections, the process by which prisoners deemed unable to work were chosen for the gas chamber. They described her shooting prisoners during roll calls. And they described something that witnesses recalled with particular horror: the smirk. At her trial in Hamburg in December 1946, as survivor after survivor testified about what she had done, Dorothea Binz sat in the dock and, according to multiple accounts, smirked. If you are hearing this and finding it difficult to sit with, that is the right response. Hit the like button if you believe this history needs to be told and remembered. There was also a love story at Ravensbrück, of a kind. Binz had a relationship with Edmund Browning, an SS officer at the camp, M14 EBR, who served as the head of the men's camp. They were photographed together. They were described by some accounts as genuinely in love. And this detail, the woman who beat prisoners to death with a whip, was also a woman who fell in love with a man who worked beside her, is one of the things that makes Binz's case so persistently disturbing. She was not a caricature. She was a human being who made choices. Browning was also tried and convicted after the war. He received a prison sentence. Binz was sentenced to death. As Soviet forces approached Ravensbrück in April 1945, Binz fled, joining the columns of SS personnel and German civilians moving west, attempting to disappear into the chaos of a collapsing country. She tried to blend in among the refugees. It did not work. British forces, acting on descriptions provided by Ravensbrück survivors, women who had survived what Binz had done and who could identify her on sight, captured her in Hamburg on May 3, 1945, just days after the camp's liberation. She was placed in custody at the Recklinghausen camp, a former Buchenwald subcamp, and held pending investigation. The first Ravensbrück trial opened on December 5, 1946, at the Curia House in Hamburg before a British military tribunal. 16 defendants were tried, men and women who had served at the camp in various capacities. Binz sat in the dock wearing number 5. She was one of 7 women on trial. She admitted, under examination, to beating prisoners. The survivors who testified against her were specific, detailed, and consistent. The court had no difficulty reaching its conclusions. On February 3, 1947, all defendants were found guilty. 11 were sentenced to death, including 5 women. Dorothea Binz was one of them. Hours after her death sentence was confirmed in April 1947, alone in her cell, she slashed her wrists. She was trying to die before they could hang her, to take the ending into her own hands, the way she had taken so much into her own hands at Ravensbrück. Officials found her before she could bleed to death. She was treated. She was kept alive for the gallows. On the morning of May 2, 1947, Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner, who had by this point hanged more Nazi war criminals than any other individual in history, was at Hammerlin prison. He hanged Dorothea Binz first at 9:01 in the morning, Elizabeth Marshall at 9:31, Greta Bosel at 9:55. 3 women executed one at a time, in the same prison on the same morning. Binz was the youngest. She was the first, and she was the one whose last words Pierrepoint remembered. "I hope you will not think we were all evil people." She handed him her necklace. The trapdoor opened. She was 27 years old. Historians and psychologists who have studied Binz's case have returned again and again to a question that her last words seem to be trying, however inadequately, to address. How does an ordinary girl from a small settlement in Brandenburg become the chief wardress of a concentration camp, overseeing 1,000 guards, beating women to death, smirking at survivors in a courtroom? The answer is not simple. It involves ideology and the normalization of violence, and the way that systems of power shape the people who work within them. But it also involves choice. Binz volunteered in August 1939. She was not forced. She rose through the ranks because she was good at what the system required. She smirked in the dock because, on some level, even at the end, she did not fully comprehend what she had done, or could not allow herself to. I hope you will not think we were all evil people. The question she was really asking, the question her last words gesture toward without quite reaching, is whether the word evil even applies to someone like her. Whether a person shaped by ideology and circumstance, and the normalization of violence is evil in the way that a monster in a story is evil. The survivors who testified against her, who described what she had done in specific and consistent detail, who identified her to British forces from among the chaos of the post-war refugee columns, they did not have philosophical uncertainty about the answer. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave. The British made sure of it. If you want to hear the story of another Ravensbrück guard, Carmen Maury, the Swiss spy who became a capo, who was condemned to death in the same courtroom as Binz, and then took her own life before they could carry out the sentence. That story is coming next on Ordinity. Subscribe so you don't miss it.